being in the zodiac at P, along the straight line BBP. Next, let the Earth move from B to C and Jupiter from B to C in the same time. To us, Jupiter will appear to have arrived at Q in the zodiac, having advanced in the order of the signs from P to Q. The Earth then passing to D and Jupiter to D, it will be seen in the zodiac at R, and from E, Jupiter being at E, it will appear in the zodiac at S, still advancing. But now when the Earth begins to get directly between Jupiter and the Sun, having arrived at F and Jupiter at F, to us Jupiter will appear to be ready to commence returning backward through the zodiac, for during the time in which the Earth will have passed through the arc EF, Jupiter will have been slowed down between the points S and T, and will look to us almost stationary. Later the Earth coming to G, Jupiter at G, in opposition to the Sun, will be seen in the zodiac at U, turned far back through the whole arc TU in the zodiac, but in reality, following always its uniform course, it has advanced not only in its own circle, but in the zodiac too, with respect to the center of the zodiac and to the Sun, which is located there. The Earth and Jupiter then continuing their movements. When the Earth is at H and Jupiter is at H, it will be seen as having returned far back through the zodiac by the whole arc UX. But the Earth having arrived at I and Jupiter at I, it will apparently have moved in the zodiac by only the small space XY, and will there appear stationary. Then when the Earth shall have progressed to K and Jupiter to K, Jupiter will have advanced through the arc YN in the zodiac, and, continuing its course, from L the Earth will see Jupiter at L and the point Z finally. Jupiter at M will be seen from the Earth at M to have passed to A, still advancing. And its whole apparent retrograde motion in the zodiac will be as much as the arc TX, made by Jupiter while it is passing in its own circle through the arc FH, the Earth going through FH in its orbit. Now, what is said here of Jupiter is to be understood of Saturn and Mars also. In Saturn, these retrogressions are somewhat more frequent than in Jupiter, because its motion is slower than Jupiter's, so that the Earth overtakes it in a shorter time. In Mars, they are rarer, its motion being faster than that of Jupiter, so that the Earth spends more time in catching up with it. Next, as to Venus and Mercury, whose circles are included within that of the Earth, stoppings and retrograde motions appear in them also, due not to ANV motion that really exists in them, but to the annual motion of the Earth. This is acutely demonstrated by Copernicus, enlisting the aid of Apollonius of Perga in chapter 35 of Book V in his Revolutions. You see, gentlemen, with what ease and simplicity the annual motion if made by the Earth lends itself to supplying reasons for the apparent anomalies which are observed in the movements of the 5 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. It removes them all and reduces these movements to equable and regular motions, and it was Nicholas Copernicus who first clarified for us the reasons for this marvelous effect. But another effect, no less wonderful than this, and containing a knot perhaps even more difficult to untie, forces the human intellect to admit this annual rotation and to grant it to our terrestrial globe. This is a new and unprecedented theory touching the Sun itself, for the Sun has shown itself unwilling to stand alone in evading the confirmation of so important a conclusion, and instead wants to be the greatest witness of all to this, beyond exception. So now hear this new and mighty marvel. There ensues a theory of solar rotation on dual axes based upon the movement of sunspots, which Galileo may have been the first to observe with his telescope, and which others thought to be possible satellites or moons orbiting the Sun. This, Simplicio, is all that occurred to my friend and to myself regarding that which might be adduced in explanation of the appearances and defense of their opinions by the Copernicans and by the Ptolemaics. You may do with it whatever your own judgment persuades you to do. Simp. I recognize my own incapacity to take upon myself so important a decision. As to my own ideas, I remain neutral, in the hope that a time will come when the mind will be freed by an illumination from higher contemplations than these of our human reasoning, and all the mist which keep it darkened will be swept away. SGR. Simplicio's counsel is excellent and pious, and worthy of being accepted and followed by everyone, since only that which is derived from the highest wisdom and supreme authority may be embraced with complete security. But so far as human reason is allowed to penetrate, confining myself within the bounds of theory and of probable causes, I shall indeed say, with a little more boldness than Simplicio exhibits, that I have not, among all the many profundities that I have ever heard, met with anything which is more wonderful to my intellect or has more decisively captured my mind, outside of pure geometrical and arithmetical proofs, than these two conjectures, one of which is taken from the stoppings and retrograde motions of the 5 planets, and the other from the peculiarities of movement of the sunspots. And it appears to me that they yield easily and clearly the true cause of such strange phenomena, showing the reason for such phenomena to be a simple motion which is mixed with many others that are also simple but that differ among themselves. Moreover, they show this without introducing any difficulties. Rather, they remove all those which accompany other viewpoints. So much so that I am rapidly coming to the conclusion that those who remain hostile toward this doctrine must either not have heard it or must not have understood these arguments, which are so numerous and so conclusive. Self. I do not give these arguments the status of either conclusiveness or of inconclusiveness, since, as I have said before, my intention has not been to solve anything about this momentous question, but merely to set forth those physical and astronomical reasons which the two sides can give me to set forth. I leave to others the decision, which ultimately should not be ambiguous, since one of the arrangements must be true and the other false. Hence, it is not possible within the bounds of human learning that the reasons adopted by the right side should be anything but clearly conclusive, and those opposed to them, vain and ineffective. SGR. Then it is now time for us to hear the other side, from that booklet of theses or disquisitions which Simplicio has brought back with him. Simp. Here is the book, and here is the place in which the author first briefly describes the system of the world according to the position of Copernicus, saying, Turam igitur una cum luna lotoque hoc element ari Copernicus etc., therefore the earth, together with the moon and all this elemental world, Copernicus etc. Self. Wait a bit, Simplicio, for it seems to me that this author at the very outset declares himself to be very ill-informed about the position he undertakes to refute. When he says that Copernicus makes the earth together with the moon trace out the orbis magnus in a year, moving from east to west, a thing which, as it is false and impossible, has accordingly never been uttered by Copernicus. Indeed, he makes it go in the opposite direction, I mean from west to east, that is, in the ords 6 are of the signs of the zodiac, so that it appears that the annual motion belongs to the sun, which is placed immovably in the center of the zodiac. You see the excessive boldness of this man's self-confidence, setting himself up to refute another's doctrine while remaining ignorant of the basic foundations upon which the greatest and most important parts of the whole structure are supported. This is a poor beginning for gaining the confidence of the reader, but let us proceed. Simp. The system of the universe explained, he begins to propose his objections against the annual movement. The first of these he utters ironically, in derision of Copernicus and his followers, writing that in this fantastic arrangement of the world one must affirm the most sublime inanities, that the sun, Venus, and Mercury are beneath the earth, that heavy material naturally ascends and light stuff descends, that Christ, our Savior and Redeemer, rose to hell and descended into heaven when he approached the sun, that when Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, the earth stood still, else the sun moved opposite to the earth, that when the sun is in Cancer, the earth is running through Capricorn, so that the winter signs make the summer and the spring signs the autumn, that the stars do not rise and set for the earth, but the earth for them, and that the east starts in the west while the west begins in the east. In a word, that nearly the whole course of the world is turned inside out. Self. All of this is satisfactory to me except as having mixed passages from the ever-venerable and mighty holy scriptures among these apish puerilities, and as having tried to utilize sacred things for wounding anybody who might, without either affirming or denying anything, philosophize jokingly and in sport, having made certain assumptions and desiring to argue about them among friends. Simp. Truly he scandalized me too, and not a little, especially later, when he adds that if indeed the Copernicans answer these and the like arguments in some distorted way, they still will not be able to answer satisfactorily some things which come later. South. Oh, that is worst of all, for he is pretending to have things which are more effective and convincing than the authority of Holy Writ. But let us, for our part, revere it, and pass on to physical and human arguments. Yet if he does not adduce among his physical arguments matters which make more sense than those set forth up to this point, we may as well abandon him entirely. I am certainly not in favor of wasting words answering such trifling tomfooleries. And as for his saying that the Copernicans do reply to these objections, that is quite false. I cannot believe that any man would put himself to such a pointless waste of time. Simp. I too concur in this decision. Let us, then, listen to his other objections, which are more strongly supported. Now here, as you see, he deduces with very precise calculations that if the orbit in which Copernicus makes the Earth travel around the Sun in a year were scarcely perceptible with respect to the immensity of the stellar sphere, as Copernicus says must be assumed, then one would have to declare and maintain that the fixed stars were at an inconceivable distance from us, and that the smallest of them would be much larger than this whole orbit, while others would be larger than the orbit of Saturn. Yet such bulks are truly too vast, and are incomprehensible and unbelievable. South. I have indeed seen something similar argued against Copernicus by Tycho, so this is not the first time that I have revealed the fallacy, or better, the fallacies of this argument, built as it is upon completely false hypotheses. It is based upon a dictum of Copernicus which is taken by his adversaries with rigorous literalness, as do those quarrelsome people who, being wrong about the principal issue of the case, seize upon some single word accidentally uttered by their opponents and make a great fuss about it without ever letting up. For your better comprehension, know that Copernicus first explains the remarkable consequences to the various planets deriving from the annual movement of the Earth, in particular the forward and retrograde movements of the three outer planets. Then he adds that these apparent mutations which are perceived to be greater in Mars than in Jupiter, from Jupiter's being more distant, and still less in Saturn, from its being farther away than Jupiter, remain imperceptible in the fixed stars because of their immense distance from us in comparison with the distance of Jupiter or of Saturn. Here the adversaries of this opinion rise up, and take what Copernicus has called imperceptible as having been assumed by him to be really and absolutely non-existent, remarking that even the smallest of the fixed stars is still perceptible, since it strikes our sense of sight. They set themselves to calculating, with the introduction of still more false assumptions, and deduce that in Copernicus's doctrine one must admit that a fixed star is much larger than the orbit of the Earth. Now, in order to reveal the folly of their entire method, I shall show that by assuming that a star of the sixth magnitude may be no larger than the Sun, one may deduce by means of correct demonstrations that the distance of the fixed stars from us is sufficiently great to make quite imperceptible in them the annual movement of the Earth, which in turn causes such large and observable variations in the planets. Simultaneously, I shall clearly expose to you a gigantic fallacy in the assumptions made by the adversaries of Copernicus. To begin with, I assume along with Copernicus and in agreement with his opponents that the radius of the Earth's orbit, which is the distance from the Sun to the Earth, contains 1,208 of the Earth's radii. Secondly, I assume with the same concurrence and in accordance with the truth that the apparent diameter of the Sun at its average distance is about 1/2 a degree, or 300 minutes. This is 1,800 seconds, or 108,000 third-order divisions. And since the apparent diameter of a fixed star of the first magnitude is no more than 5 seconds, or 300 thirds, and the diameter of one of the sixth magnitude measures 50 thirds. And here is the greatest error of Copernicus's adversaries. Then the diameter of the Sun contains the diameter of a fixed star of the sixth magnitude 2,160 times. Therefore, if one assumes that a fixed star of the sixth magnitude is really equal to the Sun and not larger, this amounts to saying that if the Sun moved away until its diameter looked to be 1/2160th of what it now appears to be, its distance would have to be 2,160 times what it is in fact now. This is the same as to say that the distance of a fixed star of the sixth magnitude is 2,160 radii of the Earth's orbit. And since the distance from the Earth to the Sun is commonly granted to contain 1,208 radii of the Earth, and the distance of the fixed star is, as we said, 2,160 radii of the orbit, then the radius of the Earth in relation to that of its orbit is much greater than, almost double, the radius of that orbit in relation to the stellar sphere. Therefore, the difference in aspect of the fixed star caused by the diameter of the Earth's orbit would be little more noticeable than that which is observed in the Sun due to the radius of the Earth. Note: Galileo's numbers are inaccurate, but serve the purposes of his argument. He seriously underestimated stellar distance, but nevertheless placed the stars well beyond more typical estimations made by those he proceeds to mention. SAGR. For a first step, this is a bad fall. Salve. It is indeed wrong, since according to this author a star of the sixth magnitude would have to be as large as the Earth's orbit in order to justify the dictum of Copernicus. Yet assuming it to be equal only to the Sun, which in turn is rather less than 1/10,000,000th of that orbit, makes the stellar sphere so large and distant that this alone is sufficient to remove this objection against Copernicus. SAGR. Please make this computation for me. Salve. The calculation is very short and simple. The diameter of the Sun is 11 radii of the Earth, and the diameter of the Earth's orbit contains 2,416 of these radii, as both parties agree. So the diameter of the orbit contains that of the Sun approximately 220 times, and since spheres are to each other as the cubes of their diameters, we take the cube of 220 and we have the orbit 10,648,000 times as large as the Sun. The author would say that a star of the sixth magnitude would have to be equal to this orbit. SAGR. Then their error consists in their having been very much deceived in taking the apparent diameter of the fixed stars. Salve. That is the error, but not the only one. And truly I am quite surprised at the number of astronomers, and famous ones too, who have been quite mistaken in their determinations of the sizes of the fixed as well as the moving stars, only the two great luminaries being accepted. Among these men are Al-Farghani, Al-Battani, Thabit ben Korra, and more recently Tycho, Clavius, and all the predecessors of our academician. For they did not take care of the adventitious irradiation, which deceptively makes the stars look 100 or more times as large as they are when seen without halos. Nor can these men be excused for their carelessness. It was within their power to see the bare stars at their pleasure, for it suffices to look at them when they first appear in the evening or just before they vanish at dawn. And Venus, if nothing else, should have warned them of their mistake, being frequently seen in daytime so small that it takes sharp eyesight to see it, though in the following night it appears like a great torch. I will not believe that they thought the true disk of a torch was as it appears in profound darkness, rather than as it is when perceived in lighted surroundings, for our lights seen from afar at night look large, but from near at hand their true flames are seen to be small and circumscribed. This alone might have sufficed to make them cautious. To speak quite frankly, I thoroughly believe that none of them, not even Tycho himself, accurate as he was in handling astronomical instruments, and despite his having built such large and accurate ones without a thought for their enormous expense, ever set himself to determine and measure the apparent diameter of any star except the Sun and Moon. I think that arbitrarily and, so to speak, by rule of thumb, someone among the most ancient astronomers stated that such and such was the case, and the later ones without any further experiment adhered to what this first one had declared. For if any of them had applied himself to making any test of the matter, he would doubtless have detected the error. SAGR. But if they lacked the telescope, for you have already said that our friend came to know the truth of the matter by means of that instrument, they ought to be pardoned, not accused of negligence. Salve. That would be true if they could not have obtained the result without the telescope. It is true that the telescope, by showing the disk of the star bare and very many times enlarged, renders the operations much easier, but one could carry them on without it, though not with the same accuracy. I have done so, and this is the method I have used. I hung up a light rope in the direction of a star. I made use of vega, which rises between the north and the northeast. And then by approaching and retreating from this chord placed between me and the star, I found the point where its width just hid the star from me. This done, I found the distance of my eye from the chord, which amounts to the same thing as one of the sides, which includes the angle formed at my eye and extending over the breadth of the chord. Salviati embarks upon a description of his method for measuring the angular diameter of a star by attempting to remove the halo of light surrounding it. By this method, he claimed to have discovered that stars have a significantly smaller angular diameter than the Eve normally beholds. This leads to a brief excursion into optical properties before returning of the question of the star's distance. Salve. Simplicio, I wish you could for a moment put aside your affection for the followers of your doctrines and tell me frankly whether you believe that they comprehend in their own minds this magnitude which they subsequently decide cannot be ascribed to the universe because of its immensity. I myself believe that they do not. It seems to me that here the situation is just as it is with the grasp of numbers when one gets up into the thousands of millions, and the imagination becomes confused and can form no concept. The same thing happens in comprehending the magnitudes of immense distances. There comes into our reasoning an effect similar to that which occurs to the senses on a serene night. When I look at the stars and judge by sight that their distance is but a few miles, or that the fixed stars are not a bit farther off than Jupiter, Saturn, or even the Moon. But aside from all this, consider those previous disputes between the astronomers and the peripatetic philosophers about the reasoning as to the distance of the new stars in Cassiopeia and Sagittarius, the astronomers placing these among the fixed stars and the philosophers believing them to be closer than the Moon. How powerless are our senses to distinguish large distances from extremely large ones, even when the latter are in fact many thousands of times the larger. And finally, I ask you, zero foolish man, does your imagination first comprehend some magnitude for the universe, which you then judge to be too vast? If it does, do you like imagining that your comprehension extends beyond the divine power? Would you like to imagine to yourself things greater than God can accomplish? And if it does not comprehend this, then why do you pass judgment upon things you do not understand? Simp. These arguments are very good, and no one denies that the size of the heavens may exceed our imaginings, since God could have created it even thousands of times larger than it is. But must we not admit that nothing has been created in vain or is idle in the universe? Now when we see this beautiful order among the planets, they being arranged around the earth at distances commensurate with their producing upon it their effects for our benefit, to what end would there then be interposed between the highest of their orbits, namely Saturn's, and the stellar sphere, a vast space without anything in it, superfluous and vain, for the use and convenience of whom? Salve. It seems to me that we take too much upon ourselves, Simplicio, when we will have it that merely taking care of us is the adequate work of divine wisdom and power, and the limit beyond which it creates and disposes of nothing. I should not like to have us tie its hands so. We should be quite content in the knowledge that God and nature are so occupied with the government of human affairs that they could not apply themselves more to us even if they had no other cares to attend to than those of the human race alone. I believe that I can explain what I mean by a very appropriate and most noble example, derived from the action of the light of the sun. For when the sun draws up some vapors here, or warms a plant there, it draws these and warms this as if it had nothing else to do. Even in ripening a bunch of grapes, or perhaps just a single grape, it applies itself so effectively that it could not do more even if the goal of all its affairs were just the ripening of this one grape. Now if this grape receives from the sun everything it can receive, and is not deprived of the least thing by the sun, simultaneously producing thousands and thousands of other results, then that grape would be guilty of pride or envy if it believed or demanded that the action of the sun's rays should be employed upon itself alone. I am certain that divine providence omits none of the things which look to the government of human affairs, but I cannot bring myself to believe that there may not be other things in the universe dependent upon the infinity of its wisdom, at least so far as my reason informs me. Yet if the facts were otherwise, I should not resist believing in reasoning which I had borrowed from a higher understanding. Meanwhile, when I am told that an immense space interposed between the planetary orbits and the starry sphere would be useless and vain, being idle and devoid of stars, and that any immensity going beyond our comprehension would be superfluous for holding the fixed stars, I say that it is brash for our feebleness to attempt to judge the reason for God's actions, and to call everything in the universe vain and superfluous, which does not serve us. Sagr. Say rather, and I think you will be speaking more accurately, which we do not know to serve us. I believe that one of the greatest pieces of arrogance, or rather madness, that can be thought of is to say, since I do not know how Jupiter or Saturn is of service to me, they are superfluous, and even do not exist. Because, zero deluded man, neither do I know how my arteries are of service to me, nor my cartilages, spleen, or gall. I should not even know that I had gall, or a spleen, or kidneys, if they had not been shown to me in many dissected corpses. Even then I could understand what my spleen does for me only if it were removed. In order to understand how some celestial body acted upon me, since you want all their actions to be directed at me, it would be necessary to remove that body for a while, and say that whatever effect I might then feel to be missing in me depended upon that star. Besides, what does it mean to say that the space between Saturn and the fixed stars, which these men call too vast and useless, is empty of world bodies? That we do not see them, perhaps? Then did the 4 satellites of Jupiter and the companions of Saturn come into the heavens when we began seeing them, and not before? Were there not innumerable other fixed stars before men began to see them? The nebulae were once only little white patches. Have we with our telescopes made them become clusters of many bright and beautiful stars? Oh, the presumptuous, rash ignorance of mankind. Self. There is no need, Segredo, to probe any farther into their fruitless exaggerations. Let us continue our plan, which is to examine the validity of the arguments brought forward by each side without deciding anything, leaving the decision to those who know more about it than we. Returning to our natural and human reason, I say that these terms large, small, immense, minute, etc. are not absolute, but relative. The same thing in comparison with various others may be called at one time immense and at another imperceptible, let alone small. Such being the case, I ask, in relation to what can the stellar sphere of Copernicus be called too vast? So far as I can see, it cannot be compared or said to be too vast except in relation to some other thing of the same kind. Now let us take the smallest thing of the same kind, which will be the orbit of the moon. If the stellar orb must be considered too vast in relation to that of the moon, then every other magnitude which exceeds some other of its kind by a similar or greater ratio ought also to be said to be too vast, and likewise, by the same reasoning, it should be said not to exist in the universe. Then the elephant and the whale will be mere chimeras and poetical fictions, because the former are too vast in comparison with ants, being land animals, and the latter in relation to gudgeons, being fish. And if actually found in nature, they would be immeasurably large, for the elephant and whale certainly exceed the ant and gudgeon in a much greater ratio than the stellar sphere does that of the moon. Taking the stellar sphere to be as large as is required by the Copernican system. Besides, how large is the sphere of Jupiter, and how great is that assigned to Saturn as the receptacle of a single star, though the planet itself is small in comparison with a fixed star? Surely if to each fixed star such a large portion of the space in the universe should be assigned as its container, that orb which contains an innumerable quantity of these would have to be made many thousands of times larger than suffices for the needs of Copernicus. Moreover, do you not call a fixed star very small, I mean? Even one of the most conspicuous ones, let alone those which escape our sight? And we call it so in comparison with the surrounding space. Now if the whole stellar sphere were one single blazing body, who is there that does not understand that in an infinite space there could be assigned a distance so great that from there, such a brilliant sphere would appear as small as or even smaller than a fixed star now appears to us from the earth? So from such a point we should judge as small the very things which we now call immeasurably huge. Sgr. To me, a great ineptitude exists on the part of those who would have it that God made the universe more in proportion to the small capacity of their reason than to his immense, his infinite, power. SEMP. All this that you are saying is good, But what the other side objects to is having to grant that a fixed star must be not only equal to, but much greater than, the Sun, for both are still individual bodies located within the stellar orb. And it seems to me much to the purpose that this author inquires, to what end and use are such vast frames? Produced for the Earth, perhaps? That is, for a trifling little dot? And why so remote as to appear very small and be absolutely unable to act in any way upon the Earth? To what purpose such a disproportionately large abyss between these and Saturn? All these things are baffling, for they cannot be maintained by probable reasons. Self. From the questions this fellow asks, it seems to me that one may deduce that if only the sky, the stars, and their distances were permitted to keep the sizes and magnitudes which he has believed in up to this point, though he has surely never imagined for them any comprehensible magnitudes, then he would completely understand and be satisfied about the benefits which would proceed from them to the Earth, which itself would no longer be such a trifling thing. Nor would these stars any longer be so remote as to seem quite minute, but large enough to be able to act upon the Earth. And the distance between them and Saturn would be in good proportion, and he would have very probable reasons for everything, which I should very much like to have heard. But seeing how confused and contradictory he is in these few words leads me to believe that he is very thrifty with or else hard up for these probable reasons, and that what he calls reasons are more likely fallacies, even shadows of foolish fantasies. Therefore I ask him whether these celestial bodies really act upon the Earth, and whether it was for that purpose that they were made of such and such sizes and arranged at such and such distances, or whether they have nothing to do with terrestrial affairs. If they have nothing to do with the Earth, then it is a great folly for us terrestrials to want to be arbiters of their sizes and regulators of their local dispositions, we being quite ignorant of all their affairs and interests. But if he says that they do act, and that it is to this end that they are directed, then this amounts to admitting what he denies in another place, and praising what he has just finished condemning when he said that celestial bodies located at such distances from the Earth as to appear minuscule could not act upon it in any way. Now, my good man, in the starry sphere, which is already established at whatever distance it is, and which you have just decided is well proportioned for an influence upon terrestrial matters, a multitude of stars do appear quite small, and 100 times as many are entirely invisible to us, which is to appear smaller than small. Therefore you must now, contradicting yourself, deny their action upon the Earth, or else, still contradicting yourself, admit that their appearing small does not detract from their power to act. Or else, and this would be a frank and honest confession, you must grant and freely admit that your judgment about their sizes and distances was folly, not to say presumption or brashness. Simp. As a matter of fact, I also saw immediately, upon reading this passage, the obvious contradiction in his saying that the stars of Copernicus, so to speak, could not act upon the Earth because they appeared so small, and his not noticing that he had granted action upon the Earth to the stars of Ptolemy and his own, these not merely appearing small but being for the most part invisible. Self. But now I come to another point. Upon what basis does he say that the stars appear so small? Is it perhaps because that is the way they look to us? Does he not know that this comes about from the instrument which we use in looking at them, that is, our eyes? Or for that matter, that by changing instruments we may see them larger and larger, as much as we please? Who knows, perhaps to the Earth, which beholds them without eyes, they may appear quite huge and as they really are. But it is time for us to leave these trifles and get to more important matters. I have already demonstrated two things. First, at what distance the firmament may be placed so that the diameter of the Earth's orbit would make no greater variation in it than that which the terrestrial diameter makes with respect to the Sun at its distance therefrom. And I then showed that in order to make a fixed star appear to us as of the size we see, it is not necessary to assume it to be larger than the Sun. Now I should like to know whether Tycho or any of his disciples has ever tried to investigate in any way whether any phenomenon is perceived in the stellar sphere by which one might boldly affirm or deny the annual motion of the Earth. SAGR. I should answer no for them, they having had no need to do so, since Copernicus himself says that there is no such variation there, and they, arguing ad hominem, grant this to him. Then on this assumption they show the improbability which follows from it. Namely, it would be required to make the sphere so immense that in order for a fixed star to look as large as it does, it would actually have to be so immense in bulk as to exceed the Earth's orbit, a thing which is, as they say, entirely unbelievable. So it seems to me, and I believe that they argue against the man more in the defense of another man than out of any great desire to get at the truth. And not only do I believe that none of them ever applied himself to making such observations, but I am not even sure that any of them knew what variation ought to be produced in the fixed stars by the annual movement of the Earth, if the stellar sphere were not at such a distance that any variation in them would vanish on account of its smallness. For to stop short of such researches and fall back upon the mere dictum of Copernicus may suffice to refute the man, but certainly not to clear up the fact. Now it might be that there is a variation, but that it is not looked for, or that because of its smallness, or through lack of accurate instruments, it was not known by Copernicus. Note: stellar parallax will not be detected until 1837. This would not be the first thing that he failed to know, either for lack of instruments or from some other deficiency. Yet, grounded upon most solid theories, he affirmed what seemed to be contradicted by things he did not understand. For as already said, without a telescope it cannot be comprehended that Mars does increase 60 times and Venus 40 times in one position as against another, and their differences appear to be much less than the true ones. Yet since the time it has become certain that such variations are, to a hair, just what the Copernican system required. Hence it would be a good thing to investigate with the greatest possible precision whether one could really observe such a variation as ought to be perceived in the fixed stars. Assuming an annual motion of the Earth. There follows a discussion about just what sorts of movements would or would not be perceptible among the stars, given the Earth's annual rotation on a fixed axis, and Salvian's assertion that the stars are not all equidistant from the supposed center of the universe. Really, to be quite frank, I do feel a great repugnance against having to concede the distance of the fixed stars to be so great that the alterations just explained would have to remain entirely imperceptible in them. Do not completely despair, Simplicio. Perhaps there is yet some way of tempering your difficulties. First of all, that the apparent size of the stars is not seen to alter visibly need not appear entirely improbable to you when you see that men's estimates in such a matter may be so grossly in error, particularly when looking at brilliant objects. Looking, for example, at a burning torch from a distance of 200 paces, and then coming closer by 3 or 4 yards, do you believe that you yourself would perceive it as larger? For my part, I should certainly not discover this even if I approached by 20 or 30 paces. Sometimes I have even happened to see such a light at a distance, and been unable to decide whether it was coming toward me or going away, when in fact it was approaching. Now what of this? If the same approach and retreat of Saturn, I mean double the distance from the Sun to us, is almost entirely imperceptible, and if it is scarcely noticeable in Jupiter, what could it amount to in the fixed stars, which I believe you would not hesitate to place twice as far away as Saturn? In Mars, which while approaching us. Please do not labor this point, for I am indeed convinced that what you have said about the unaltered appearance of the apparent sizes of the fixed stars may very well be the case. But what shall we say to that other difficulty which arises from no variation at all being seen in their changing aspects? Let us say something which will perhaps satisfy you also on this point. Briefly, would you be content if those alterations really were perceived in the stars which seem to you so necessary, if the annual motion belongs to the Earth? I should indeed be, so far as this particular is concerned. I wish you had said that if such a variation were perceived, nothing would remain that could cast doubt upon the Earth's mobility, since no counter could be found to such an event. But even though this may not make itself visible to us, the Earth's mobility is not thereby excluded, nor its immobility necessarily proved. It is possible, Copernicus declares, that the immense distance of the starry sphere makes such small phenomena unobservable. And as has already been remarked, it may be that up to the present they have not even been looked for, or, if looked for, not sought out in such a way as they need to be. That is, with all necessary precision and minute accuracy. It is hard to achieve this precision, both on account of the imperfection of astronomical instruments, which are subject to much variation, and because of the shortcomings of those who handle them with less care than is required. A cogent reason for putting little faith in such observations is the disagreement we find among astronomers. In assigning the places, I shall say not merely of novas and of comets, but of the fixed stars themselves, and even of polar altitudes, about which they disagree most of the time by many minutes. As a matter of fact, how would you expect anyone to be sure, with a quadrant or sextant that customarily has an arm 3 or 4 yards long, that he is not out by 2 or 3 minutes in the setting of the perpendicular or the alignment of the alidade? Note, an instrument for angular measurements. For on such a circumference this will be no more than the thickness of a millet seed. Besides which, it is almost impossible for the instrument to be constructed absolutely accurate and then maintained so. Ptolemy distrusted an armillary instrument constructed by Archimedes himself for determining the entry of the sun into the equinox. Simp. But if the instruments are thus suspect, and the observations are so dubious, how can we ever safely accept them and free them from error? I have heard great vauntings of Tycho's instruments, which were made at enormous expense, and of his remarkable skill in making observations. Self. I grant you all this, but neither the one fact nor the other suffices to make us certain in affairs of such importance. I want to have us use instruments far larger than those of Tycho's, quite precise ones, and made at minimum cost, whose sides will be 4, 6, 20, 30, or 50 miles, so that a degree is a mile wide, a minute is 50 yards, and a second is little less than a yard. In a word, we may have them as large as we please, without their costing us a thing. Being at a villa of mine near Florence, I plainly observed the arrival of the sun at the summer solstice and its subsequent departure. For one evening at its setting it hid itself behind a cliff in the Pietrapana Mountains, about 60 miles away, leaving only a small shred of itself revealed to the north, the breadth of which was not the 100th part of its diameter. But the following evening, at the same position of setting, it left a like part of itself showing, which was noticeably thinner. This is a conclusive proof that it had commenced to move away from the tropic. Yet the sun's return between the first and second observation surely did not amount to 1 second of arc along the horizon. Making the observation later with a fine telescope which would multiply the disk of the sun more than a thousandfold turned out to be pleasant and easy. Now my idea is for us to make our observations of the fixed stars with similar instruments, utilizing some star in which the changes would be conspicuous. These are, as I have already explained, the ones which are farthest from the ecliptic. Among them Vega, a very large star close to the pole of the ecliptic, would be the most convenient when operating in the manner I am about to describe to you, so far as the more northern countries are concerned, though I am going to make use of another star. I have already been looking by myself for a place well adapted for such observations. The place is an open plain, above which there rises to the north a very prominent mountain, at the summit of which is built a little chapel facing west and east, so that the ridgepole of its roof may cut at right angles the meridian over some house situated in the plain. I wish to affix a beam parallel to that ridgepole and about a yard above it. This done, I shall seek in the plain that place from which one of the stars of the Big Dipper is hidden by this beam which I have placed, just when the star crosses the meridian. Or else, if the beam is not large enough to hide the star, I shall find the place from which the disk of the star is seen to be cut in half by the beam, an effect which can be discerned perfectly by means of a fine telescope. It will be very convenient if there happens to be some house at the place from which this event can be perceived, but if not, then I shall drive a stick firmly into the ground and affix a mark to indicate where the eye is to be placed whenever the observation is to be repeated. I shall make the first of these observations at the summer solstice, in order to continue them from month to month, or whenever I please, until the other solstice. By means of such observations, the stars rising or lowering can be perceived no matter how small it may be. And if in the course of these operations any such variation shall happen to become known, how great an achievement will be made in astronomy, for by this means, besides ascertaining the annual motion, we shall be able to gain a knowledge of the size and distance of that same star. SGR. I thoroughly understand the whole procedure, and the operations seem to me to be so easy and so well adapted to what is wanted, that it may very reasonably be believed that Copernicus himself, or some other astronomer, has actually performed them. Self. It seems the other way around to me, for it is improbable that if anyone had tried this he would not have mentioned the result, whichever opinion it turned out to favor. But no one is known to have availed himself of this method, for the above or for any other purpose, and without a fine telescope it could not very well be put into effect. SGR. What you say completely satisfies me. Now, since quite a while remains until the night, if you want me to find any rest then, I hope it will not be too much trouble for you to explain to us those problems which a little while ago you asked us to put off until tomorrow. Please give us back the reprieve which we extended to you, and abandoning all other arguments explain to us how, assuming the motions which Copernicus attributes to the earth, and keeping immovable the sun and the fixed stars, such events may follow as pertain to the elevation and lowering of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the inequalities of nights and days, in just the way that is so easily understood to take place in the Ptolemaic system. South. I must not and cannot refuse anything which Segreto pleads for. The delay that I requested was only to give me time to rearrange in my mind the premises which are useful for a clear and comprehensive explanation of the manner in which these events take place in the Copernican as well as in the Ptolemaic system. Indeed, more easily and simply in the former than in the latter, so that it may be clearly seen that the former hypothesis is as easy for nature to put into effect as it is hard for the intellect to comprehend. Nevertheless, I hope, by utilizing explanations other than those resorted to by Copernicus, to make even the learning of it very much less obscure. In order to do this, I shall set forth some assumptions as known and self-evident, as follows. First, I assume that the Earth is a spherical body which rotates about its own axis and poles, and that every point on its surface traces out the circumference of a circle, greater or lesser according as the designated point is more or less distant from the poles. Of these circles, that one is greatest which is traced out by a point equidistant from the poles. All these circles are parallel to one another, and we shall refer to them as parallels. Second, the Earth being spherical in shape and its material being opaque, half its surface is continually lighted and the rest is dark. The boundary which separates the lighted part from the dark being a great circle, we shall call this the boundary circle of light. Third, when the boundary circle of light passes through the Earth's poles, it will cut all the parallels into equal sections, it being a great circle, but, not passing through the poles, it will cut them all into unequal parts except the central circle. This, being also a great circle, will be cut into equal parts in any case. Fourth, since the Earth turns about its own poles, the length of day and night is determined by the arcs of the parallels cut by the boundary circle of light. The arc which remains in the illuminated hemisphere determines the length of the day, and the remainder that of the night. These things being set forth, we may wish to draw a diagram for a clearer understanding of what comes next. Figure 6. First, let us indicate the circumference of a circle to represent for us the orbit of the Earth, described in the plane of the ecliptic. This we may divide by 2 diameters into 4 equal parts, Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, and Aries, which shall here represent at the same time the 4 cardinal points, that is, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. And in the center of this circle, let us denote the sun, O, fixed and immovable. Now with the 4 points Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, and Aries as centers, we shall draw 4 equal circles which to us will represent the Earth at these 4 different seasons. The center of the Earth travels in the space of a year around the whole circumference Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, Libra. Note, counterclockwise, from the left, the top of the page, moving from west to east in the order of the signs of the zodiac. It is already evident that when the Earth is in Capricorn, the Sun will appear in Cancer, the Earth moving along the arc from Capricorn to Aries. The Sun will appear to be moving along the arc from Cancer to Libra. In a word, it will run through the signs of the zodiac in their order during the space of a year. So with this first assumption, the apparent annual motion of the Sun around the ecliptic is satisfied beyond any argument. Coming now to the other movement, that is, the diurnal motion of the Earth about itself, its poles and axis must be established. These must be understood to be not perpendicularly erect to the plane of the ecliptic, that is, not parallel to the axis of the Earth's orbit, but inclined from right angles about 23½ degrees, with the North Pole toward the axis of the Earth's orbit when the center of the Earth is at the solstitial point in Capricorn, assuming, then, that the center of the terrestrial globe is at that point. Let us indicate the poles and the axis AB, tilted 23½ degrees from the perpendicular on the Capricorn-Cancer diameter, so that the angle A Capricorn-Cancer amounts to the complement, or 66½ degrees, and this inclination must be assumed to be immutable. We shall take the upper pole, A, to be the north, and the other, B, the south. If the Earth is assumed to revolve about its axis AB in 24 hours, also from west to east, circles parallel to one another will be described by all points noted on its surface. In this first position of the Earth, we shall designate the great circle CD and the two which are 23½ degrees from it F above, and GN below, and these others at the two extremes, 1K and LM, at a similar distance from the poles A and B. And we could have drawn countless other circles parallel to these five, traced by innumerable points on the Earth. Let us now assume that the Earth is transported by the annual motion of its center to the other positions already marked, passing to them according to the following laws: that its own axis AB not only does not change its inclination to the plane of the ecliptic, but that it does not vary its direction, either, remaining thus always parallel to itself. It points continually toward the same parts of the universe, or let us say of the firmament. This means that if we imagine the axis to be prolonged, it would describe with its upper end a circle parallel and equal to the Earth's orbit through Libra, Capricorn, Aries, and Cancer, as the upper base of a cylinder described by itself in its annual motion upon the lower base, Libra, Capricorn, Aries, Cancer. Hence, because of this unchanging tilt, let us draw these other three figures around the centers of Aries, Cancer, and Libra, exactly similar to the one drawn around the center of Capricorn. Next, let us consider the first diagram of the Earth. Because of the axis AB being inclined at 23½ degrees toward the Sun, and since the arc Al is also 23½ degrees, the light of the Sun illumines the hemisphere of the terrestrial globe exposed to the Sun, of which only half is seen here, divided from the dark part by the boundary of light. I am the parallel CD, being a great circle, will be divided into equal parts by this, but all others will be cut into unequal parts because the boundary of light W does not pass through the poles A and B. The parallel IK, together with all others described between it and the pole A, will be entirely within the illuminated part, just as on the other hand the opposite ones toward the pole B and contained within the parallel LM will remain in the dark. Besides this, since the arc Al is equal to the arc FD, and the arc AF is common to IKF and AFD, the latter two are equal, each being one quadrant. And since the whole arc IFM is a semicircle, the arc MF will also be a quadrant and equal to FKI. Hence the Sun, 0, in this position of the Earth, will be vertical to anyone at the point F. But through the diurnal revolution around the fixed axis AB, all points on the parallel EF pass through this same point F, and therefore on such a day the Sun at midday will be overhead to all inhabitants of the parallel EF, and to them it will seem to describe by its motion that circle which we call the Tropic of Cancer. But to the inhabitants of all parallels above the parallel EF toward the North Pole, A, the Sun is below their zenith toward the south. On the other hand, to all inhabitants of the parallels below EF toward the equator CID in the South Pole B, the midday Sun is elevated above the zenith toward the North Pole, A. Next, you may see how of all parallels, only the great circle CD is cut into equal parts by the boundary of light IM, the others above and below this all being cut into unequal parts. Of the upper ones, the semi-diurnal arcs, which are those in the part of the Earth lighted by the Sun, are greater than the semi-nocturnal ones, which remain in the dark. The contrary happens for the remainder which are beneath the great circle CD toward the pole B. Of these, the semi-diurnal arcs are smaller than the semi-nocturnal. Also, you may see quite plainly that the differences of these arcs go on increasing as the parallels become closer to the poles, until the parallel IK stays entirely in the lighted part, and its inhabitants have a 24-hour day without night. In contrast to this, the parallel LM, remaining all in the dark, has a night of 24 hours without day. Next, let us proceed to the third diagram of the Earth, here placed with its center at the Cancer point, from which the Sun would appear to be at the first point of Capricorn. It is indeed easy to see that as the axis AB has not changed its tilt, but has remained parallel to itself, the appearance and situation of the Earth are precisely the same as in the first diagram, except that the hemisphere which in the first was lighted by the Sun remains in shadow here, and the one which was previously dark now becomes illuminated. Hence, what occurred in the first diagram is now reversed with respect to the differences of days and nights in their relative length or shortness. The first thing noticed is that where in the first figure, the circle 1K was entirely in the light, it is now all in the dark, and LM, which opposite, is now entirely in the light, where it was previously completely in shadow. Of the parallels between the great circle CD and the pole A, the semidiurnal arcs are now smaller than the seminocturnal, which is the opposite of the first, and of the others toward the pole B. The semidiurnal arcs are now longer than the seminocturnal, likewise the opposite of what took place in the other position of the Earth. You may now see the Sun made vertical to the inhabitants of the tropic GN, and for those of the parallel EF, it is depressed southward through the entire arc ECG, that is, 47 degrees. It has, in short, gone from one tropic to the other, passing through the equator, being raised and then dropped along the meridian through the said interval of 47 degrees. This entire change has its origin not in any dropping or rising of the Earth, on the contrary, in its never dropping nor rising, but in generally keeping itself always in the same location with respect to the universe and merely going around the Sun, which is situated at the center of this same plane in which the Earth moves around it in the annual motion. Here a remarkable phenomenon must be noticed, which is that just as the preservation of the axis of the Earth in the same direction with respect to the universe, or let us say toward the highest fixed stars, makes the Sun appear to us to rise and fall by as much as 47 degrees without any rise or drop in the fixed stars at all. So if on the contrary the Earth's axis were continually kept at a given inclination toward the Sun, or we might say toward the axis of the zodiac, no alteration of ascent or descent would appear to be made by the Sun. Thus the inhabitants of a given place would always have the same periods of night and day, and the same kind or season, that is, some people would always have winter, some always summer, some spring, etc. But on the other hand, the changes in the fixed stars with regard to rising and falling would then appear enormous to us, amounting to this same 47 degrees. For an understanding of this, let us go back to a consideration of the position of the Earth in the first diagram, where the axis AB is seen with its upper pole A tilted toward the Sun. In the third figure, the same axis has kept the same direction toward the highest sphere by remaining parallel to itself, so the upper pole no longer tilts toward the Sun but tilts away from it, and lies 47 degrees from its first position. Thus, in order to reproduce the same inclination of the pole A toward the Sun, it would be required, by turning the globe along its circumference ACBD, to take it 47 degrees toward E. And any fixed star observed on the meridian would be raised or lowered by that many degrees. Now let us proceed with an explanation of the rest, and consider the Earth placed in the fourth diagram with its center at the first point of Libra, the Sun appearing in the beginning of Aries. Thus the Earth's axis, which in the first diagram was assumed to be inclined to the Capricorn-Cancer diameter and hence to be in the same plane as that which cuts the Earth's orbit perpendicularly in the Capricorn-Cancer line, when transferred to the fourth figure, being kept always parallel to itself, as we have said, comes to be in a plane which is likewise vertical to the plane of the Earth's orbit, and parallel to the one which cuts the latter at right angles along the Capricorn-Cancer diameter. Hence the line from the center of the Sun to the center of the Earth, from 0 to Libra, will be perpendicular to the axis BA. But this same line from the center of the Sun to the center of the Earth is always perpendicular also to the boundary circle of light. Therefore, this same circle will pass through the poles A and B in the fourth figure, and the axis AB will lie in its plane. But the great circle, passing through the poles of the parallels, will divide them all into equal parts. Therefore, the arcs IK, EF, CD, GN, and LM will all be semicircles, and the lighted hemisphere will be this one which faces us and the Sun. And the boundary circle of light will be this very circumference ACBD. And when the Earth is at this place, the equinox will occur for all its inhabitants. The same will happen in the second diagram, where the Earth having its lighted hemisphere toward the Sun shows to us its dark side with the nocturnal arcs. These are also all semicircles, and consequently also make an equinox. Finally, since the line produced from the center of the Sun to the center of the Earth is perpendicular to the axis AB, to which likewise the great circle CD among the parallels is perpendicular, the same line O Libra necessarily passes through the same plane as the parallel CD, cutting its circumference in the center of the daytime arc CD. Therefore, the Sun will be vertical to anyone located in that cut. But all inhabitants of that parallel pass by there, carried by the Earth's rotation, and have the midday Sun directly overhead. Therefore, the Sun will appear to all inhabitants of the Earth to be tracing out the greatest parallel, called the equatorial circle. Moreover, the Earth being at either of the solstitial points, one of the polar circles IK, or LM, is entirely in the light and the other in the shadow, but when the Earth is at the equinoctial points, half of each of these polar circles is in the light and the balance in the dark. It should not be hard to see how the Earth in passing, for example, from Cancer, where the parallel IK is entirely dark, to Leo, a part of the parallel IK toward the point I will commence to enter the light. And the boundary of light IM will begin to retreat toward the poles A and B, cutting the circle ACBD no longer at I and M, but in two other points failing between the endpoints I, A, M, and B of the arcs IA and MB. Thus the inhabitants of the circle IK begin to enjoy the light, and those of the circle LM to experience the darkness. C. Then, how two simple non-contradictory motions assigned to the Earth, performed in periods well suited to their sizes, and also conducted from west to east, as in the case of all movable world bodies, supply adequate causes for all the visible phenomena. These phenomena can be reconciled with a fixed Earth only by renouncing all the symmetry that is seen among the speeds and sizes of moving bodies, and attributing an inconceivable velocity to an enormous sphere beyond all the others, while lesser spheres move very slowly. Besides, one must make the motion of the former contrary to that of the latter, and to increase the improbability, must have the highest sphere transport all the lower ones opposite to their own inclination. I leave it to your judgment, which has the more likelihood in it. SAGR. For my part, so far as my senses are concerned, there is a great difference between the simplicity and ease of effecting results by the means given in this new arrangement and the multiplicity, confusion, and difficulty found in the ancient and generally accepted one. For if the universe were ordered according to such a multiplicity, one would have to remove from philosophy many axioms commonly adopted by all philosophers. Thus it is said that nature does not multiply things unnecessarily, that she makes use of the easiest and simplest means for producing her effects, that she does nothing in vain, and the like. I must confess that I have not heard anything more admirable than this, nor can I believe that the human mind has ever penetrated into subtler speculations. I do not know how it looks to Simplicio. Simp. If I must tell you frankly how it looks to me, these appear to me some of those geometrical subtleties which Aristotle reprehended in Plato when he accused him of departing from sound philosophy by too much study of geometry. I have known some very great peripatetic philosophers, and heard them advise their pupils against the study of mathematics as something which makes the intellect sophistical and inept for true philosophizing, a doctrine diametrically opposed to that of Plato, who would admit no one into philosophy who had not first mastered geometry. Salve. I endorse the policy of these peripatetics of yours in dissuading their disciples from the study of geometry, since there is no art better suited for the disclosure of their fallacies. You see how different they are from the mathematical philosophers, who much prefer dealing with those who are well informed about the general. The third day 81. Peripatetic philosophy, than with those who lack such information, and because of that deficiency, are unable to make comparisons between one doctrine and the other. But setting all this aside, please tell me what absurdities or excessive subtleties make this Copernican arrangement the less plausible so far as you are concerned. Simp. As a matter of fact, I did not completely understand it, perhaps because I am not very well versed either in the way the same effects are produced by Ptolemy. I mean these planetary stoppings, retrograde movements, approaches and retreats, lengthenings and shortenings of the day, alterations of the seasons, etc. But passing over the consequences which stem from the basic assumptions, I feel no small difficulties to exist in these assumptions themselves. And if the assumptions fall to the ground, then they bring the whole structure into ruin. Now, since the whole framework of Copernicus seems to me to be built upon a weak foundation, being supported upon the mobility of the Earth, then if this were removed, there would be no room for further argument. And to remove it, Aristotle's axiom that to a simple body only one simple motion can be natural appears to be sufficient. Here 3 movements, if not 4, are assigned to the Earth, a simple body, and all of them are quite different from one another. For besides the straight motion toward the center, which cannot be denied to it as a heavy body, there are ascribed to it a circular motion in a great circle around the sun in 1 year, and a whirling upon itself every 24 hours. And what is most extreme, and possibly for that reason you have remained silent about this, another whirling about its own center, completed in a year, and opposite to the previously mentioned 24-hour motion. My mind feels a great repugnance to this. The 3 characters again enter the realm of physics, from which they proceed to a discussion of William Gilbert's de Wagnall 1600, his theories of magnetism and the possibility of the Earth being a lodestone. So ends the 3rd day. The 4th day, the shortest section by far, is almost entirely concerned with Galileo's theory that the Earth's motion was the cause of tides. In it he criticizes Kepler, who attributed tides to the influence of the moon. While Kepler was closer to the truth, Galileo distrusted what he viewed as the arcana of planetary influence, seeking a purely mechanical explanation.